It's a typical Tuesday in 7th grade computer class, and the students are supposed to be working on typing assignments on their district-issued Chromebooks. But if you look closely at a few of the screens, the students aren't in a typing program. They're frantically clicking through a grainy video game, desperately trying to manage virtual security cameras to avoid getting caught by a digitalized version of Jeffrey Epstein. This is Five Nights at Epstein's, a viral indie horror game that has managed to hijack the attention of middle schoolers, sparking a nationwide parent meltdown. When you look at it, the game just sort of looks like a typical shock meme game, an edgy parody meant for upvotes on Reddit. When you start looking at the layers of this phenomenon, you realize there's something a little more complex going on here. It's showing off the bizarre ways that Gen Z and Gen Alpha process real-world trauma. As this Five Nights at Epstein's game began to take hold, weird stories started spreading. A rumor that the game was mysteriously appearing on school-issued computers and tablets completely on its own. There were reports on local news broadcasts, urgent emails shared from the Parent Teacher Association, and viral threads on social media, as if this were some sort of malicious virus or a targeted cyber attack focusing specifically on the children. Won't somebody think of the children? Parents were shocked. They believed that the heavily filtered, monitored devices issued by school districts had been compromised by some outside hackers. And the rumor evolved into a modern digital ghost story. Of course, the story about Five Nights at Epstein's took on a life of its own. How did a game called Five Nights at Epstein's end up on the iPads of 12-year-olds? Well, kids are clever, and kids find a way to get away with things. Think about it. What were you doing when you were a kid? You can't understand Five Nights at Epstein's without understanding the colossal gaming empire that is Five Nights at Freddy's, or FNAF. FNAF is an absolute juggernaut for youth gamers over the last decade. It was created by Scott Cawthorn in 2014. The original game put players in the shoes of a nighttime security guard at a Chuck E. Cheese style pizzeria where animatronic mascots came to life and, well, attacked you. The best part about FNAF wasn't just the jump scares. It was the mechanics. It was the lore. Players couldn't move. They were trapped in a security office, forced to constantly monitor a network of grainy cameras and closed doors in order to survive past 6 a.m. But the FNAF community is huge because of its obsession with the hidden lore. There have been endless Reddit threads and YouTube videos analyzing hidden Easter eggs within the FNAF franchise. Kids were actively decoding these games instead of just playing them. They were conditioning themselves to look for hidden story elements and dark backstories, and even real-world parallels. So when you take this beloved game and combine it with a real-world scandal, you create something that is going to go viral. The kids already know how to play the game, and they already know that dopamine hit of surviving until the morning. The parody, Five Nights at Epstein, simply swaps out the fictional animatronic animals for real-world predators, turning this childhood game into a vehicle for navigating one of the most disturbing stories in the 21st century. So what's with the game? It's a very detailed interactive game that relies on actual legal evidence. It takes the horrors of the Epstein case and forces players to interact with them. The developer of the game made a pretty fascinating design choice. Rather than relying on drawn or 3D model fictional assets, the game actually uses photographic evidence released by the United States Department of Justice. Players are dropped into a digital rendering of Little St. James Island, the famous Epstein Island. Players go through an in-game security system and they look at real photos and renderings of the mansions outside and inside. And there are highly specific, disturbing details from the actual case files, such as a room that appears to contain dental equipment. The opening sequence of the game features a fuzzy, static-filled black screen flashing images of Epstein alongside other prominent figures named in the files, like Donald Trump and Stephen Hawking. The gameplay is designed to induce extreme anxiety, just like the original FNAF. Players are generally stationary and have to rely on environmental controls and surveillance to survive. Players have access to 11 different security cameras scattered around the virtual estate, and they have to constantly flip between these feeds to track the path of Epstein and the other characters. When Epstein gets too close, players can trigger specific audio clues in different rooms. These cues include the sound of a small child or baby crying, as well as the audio of young children giggling and saying hi. The player is forced to use the simulated distress of a child to save themselves. A pop-up warning at the start of the game tells the player that they are taking on the role of a victim but must defend themselves against Epstein. Not only do you have to avoid Epstein, you have to avoid Ghislaine Maxwell. The game also leans into the broader Epstein network, including high-profile names like Trump and Hawking, who were also in the Epstein Files. By putting these deep cuts in the game, the developer caters directly to internet sleuths who treat the real-world case files like video game lore. Now, to understand how a game like Five Nights at Epstein's gets made, you have to look at the state of indie game development. We're in an era where the barrier for entry to game creation is essentially zero. Anyone with a basic understanding of coding and access to free game engines can build and publish a video game in a matter of days. Five Nights at Epstein's is a completely fan-made project, if there are any fans. And it's obviously not affiliated with Scott Cawthon, the FNAF franchise, or any major corporate game studio. It was distributed through platforms that cater to independent developers, such as itch.io and GameJolt. These platforms are beloved by the indie community because they offer minimal oversight. Unlike the Apple App Store, or Google Play, or Steam, which have strict content moderation policies that would instantly flag and ban a game like this. Itch.io and GameJolt allow creators to publish edgy and controversial content with limited moderation. When confronted with the backlash, the developer's defense has been rooted in the long internet tradition of being an edgelord. The creator claims the game is satirical horror for a mature audience and argues that it's meant to present Epstein and his associates in a negative, highly critical light, not to glorify them. And this is a typical defense in the world of dark internet humor. The idea that rendering something taboo into a playable, terrifying joke strips the real-world monsters of their power. The developer of Five Nights at Epstein's insists that they never intended for children to play the game and says its massive popularity among middle schoolers is based on the unpredictable nature of the organic spread on social media. Five Nights at Epstein's explosive transformation into a viral nationwide phenomenon was the result of a massive, highly publicized legal and political event that pushed the Epstein case to the absolute center of our culture. On November 19th, 2025, the Epstein Files Transparency Act was signed into law by Donald Trump. The release was an earthquake. YouTubers and internet sleuths spent weeks dissecting the millions of pages. And you have to remember that kids these days, from Generation Alpha and younger Gen Z, their news cycle is filtered through the machinery of internet meme culture. The algorithms of TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and Twitter flooded their feeds with Epstein list content. And the youth naturally sought off interactive ways to engage with this story. Five Nights at Epstein's was sitting right there, a perfectly packaged, highly memeable, interactive game that allowed kids to participate in the biggest news story of the decade and maybe even the century. It was a perfect storm. And that brings us to the most fascinating part of the entire story. It's one thing for a controversial indie game to exist on the internet. There are millions. It's an entirely different thing for that game to be actively played by thousands of students during school hours on devices that are supposedly locked down by enterprise-level security software. School districts spend millions of dollars on IT infrastructure, firewalls, and web filtering designed to block non-educational content. But the spread of Five Nights at Epstein's has proven that an entire generation of middle schoolers essentially functions as a decentralized, motivated hacking group. They've completely outsmarted the adults in the room. The key to the game's infiltration lies in the fact that, while traditional PC games require a player to download an executable file and install it in their operating system, and pretty much every school IT department has completely locked this down. Students do not have the privileges to install software on their Chromebooks or their iPad. However, Five Nights at Epstein's was specifically developed and distributed as an HTML5 recreation. HTML5 is a markup language used for structuring and presenting content on the internet. The entire game runs natively inside a standard web browser like Google Chrome or Safari. There's nothing to download and there's nothing to install. Because the game is just lightweight web code, it can be cloned and hosted on virtually any domain on the internet. So if a teacher catches a kid playing the game on sketchygames123.com, I don't know if that's a real website, and reports it to IT, the IT department blocks that specific URL. 5 minutes later, another student takes the open source HTML5 code, uploads it to a new web domain, and shares the new link. The school and IT is playing digital whack-a-mole against a swarm of thousands of kids who can generate new mirror sites faster than the firewall can update. But kids aren't even just playing these on obscure domains. They're actively weaponizing the school's own educational tools against them. The workaround that students have been using to access unblocked games involves Google Workspace, specifically Google Docs and Google Drive. And here's how it works. A school can't block docs.google.com or drive.google.com because the entire curriculum relies on those platforms for assignments. Knowing this, the students have created massive shared Google Docs that act as centralized hubs for unblocked game links. Whenever an IT department blocks a URL hosting Five Nights at Epstein's, a curator student finds a new working mirror site and updates the hyperlink shared inside the Google Doc. And because the Google Doc itself is hosted on an approved safe educational domain, the school's firewall lets the student open the document without flagging it. And the document is a launchpad, allowing the student to click and look at this content. There are even extensive guides on Reddit outlining how to embed HTML5 game code directly into a Google Drive file, meaning that students never even have to leave the Google ecosystem to play the game. It's incredible. An unblockable distribution network operating right under the noses of teachers. See, when I was a kid, we had those calculators where we would put like Tetris on them. That was a big thing. Five Nights at Epstein's is part of a massive trend of true crime and real-world controversies being gamified for youth consumption. And students may view playing these games as an ironic or emotionally detached act. The consequences might be concerning. Students have been receiving official disciplinary action for actively joking about being on Epstein's island during the school day. We live in a time of the normalization of crisis. When a horrific topic becomes memeified, it rapidly loses its power to horrify. It becomes a cultural reference point without its original weight. Think about the Diddy stuff. And that's how Five Nights at Epstein's has been elevated into a massive part of our culture. The game has been cataloged on Wikipedia's lists of internet phenomenon, taking its place alongside historic viral moments like the mobile game Flappy Bird and Leroy Jenkins. Five Nights at Epstein's has gone beyond being a meme game and has become an internet phenomenon. When parents and administrators realized that this was happening on school computers, it followed a typical school panic. A student would mention the game casually at home, the parent would look into it, would be horrified, and would immediately take to local community platforms to sound the alarm. In Kearns, Utah, for example, a mother named Michelle Martinez discovered the game after her son brought it up at family dinner. After pressing him, she was stunned to learn that he and his friends had been actively playing it at school. Martinez posted a warning on a local Facebook community page, which received dozens of comments from other parents who realized their children were also playing the game. These were essentially digital public service announcements on Facebook because many parents admitted they had zero knowledge that the game existed prior to seeing the warnings in their feeds and then finding out that their kids were playing it. The panic would swell and would hit school boards. In North Carolina, the Wake County Public School System acknowledged that they were receiving a whole bunch of tickets from alarmed teachers and parents reporting the game, forcing the IT department into an endless cycle of trying to block new access points of the game. On forums like Reddit's r/teachers, educators have voiced their sheer exhaustion fighting the game, noting that the district simply lacked the manpower and technical ability to monitor every single screen in a classroom of 30 middle schoolers. The most sobering moment of the entire controversy came during a public board meeting for the Los Angeles Unified School District. A mother of two middle schoolers used her time to deliver a scathing indictment of the district's content filtering capabilities. Self pointed out that the problem had evolved far beyond the satirical game itself because students were using unblocked access points and Google Docs to bypass the firewall. They were doing more than playing Five Nights at Epstein's. They were using the vulnerabilities to access the raw, unredacted Department of Justice Epstein case files on their school-issued iPads. She said that children at her middle school were reading graphic legal descriptions of child child abuse material on devices intended for math or reading. Self-testimony became a core issue for parents. They refused to take the blame under the district's responsible use policy when the district is providing minors with unrestricted devices. The school is supposed to be a walled garden, and instead it become an open gate to the darkest corners of the internet. So to look past all this mess, we have to look past the technical failures of school IT departments. And we have to ask the question, why do 12-year-olds want to play a game about Jeffrey Epstein? Well, what were you doing when you were a kid? For Generation Z and Generation Alpha, the boundary between physical reality and digital content is non-existent. There have been massive, traumatic global events, wars, pandemics, high-profile criminal cases that are processed through the machinery of internet culture. They turn to TikTok, reaction images, and video games to understand the world. The memeification of the Epstein Files is the ultimate expression of this world. By placing Jeffrey Epstein into the mechanical framework of a familiar horror franchise, the sickening reality of his crimes is stripped of its humanity. Epstein stops being a historical predator who ruined countless lives, and he just becomes a boss monster who you avoid as part of a video game. This is abstraction, and it acts as a psychological buffer. It allows kids to interact with these controversial topics without having to feel the crushing emotional weight of them. It's a coping mechanism in the digital age. And obviously, there's the basic developmental biology of middle schoolers. When you were a middle schooler, you were constantly testing boundaries and rebelling, and you had a desperate desire to engage with forbidden adult knowledge too. This could have been sneaking into R-rated movies or trying to watch Cinemax on TV. But today, all that forbidden knowledge is on the internet. Playing a game that adults find offensive has social currency in a middle school peer group. And the fact that the game causes parental outrage is the entire point. When a student uses a secret Google Doc to bypass a school firewall to play Five Nights at Epstein's, they're successfully participating in Edgelord culture. They're outsmarting adult authority figures and proving that they can handle dark, mature themes that the adults are trying to hide from them. The fact that the kids are using this as a psychological buffer doesn't mean that having this type of exposure is harmless. They're interacting with a level of darkness that outpaces their emotional maturity. It is forcing conversations about systemic abuse and human trafficking and institutional corruption much earlier than families are prepared to have them with their kids. So psychologists are telling parents to have a conversation with their kids rather than just ban all of this type of content. They say that discovering a child playing Five Nights at Epstein should be the start of a conversation, not a reason for screaming at them and taking away their devices. Parents are encouraged to ask open-ended questions and listen carefully. Why did the child seek out the game? What do they know about the real-world context behind the memes? Do they understand who the people in the game really are? Helping a child contextualize what they're doing is much more effective in the long run than simply screaming at them and grounding them. Five Nights is a tasteless internet prank that has become a cultural phenomenon. By using the real-world DOJ imagery and the deeply unsettling audio to gamify human tragedy, it crosses a line that few pieces of media ever have. The fact that this game went viral illustrates a terrifying new reality. These generations of kids are digitally native, and they will turn breaking news into meme experiences almost instantly. For parents, teachers, and IT administrators, the panic is justified. Playing these games on school computers and iPads is a nightmare scenario for any school district. But the solution isn't just blocking the websites or locking down these computers, because it's a failing strategy. The idea of a walled garden in educational technology is dead. If a child has access to a web browser, they have access to the world. So games like Five Nights at Epstein's infiltrating our schools and kids' iPads and computers requires an open, honest communication. When the darkest corners of human history become video games, the role of the adult has to be something better than just installing a firewall. They have to sit down with the kid, look at the screen, and help them understand the real-world horror behind the game. This is a difficult conversation, and a conversation most parents don't want to have, because most parents didn't have that conversation with their parents when they were kids. But tell me, what were you doing when you were a kid? Please subscribe to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Please like and share this video. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a member of the channel. I appreciate you considering this. You can also support me by continuing to watch my videos, and I do appreciate you watching my videos. And please stay spooky.